to interrupt your luncheon, but we need to get going with our program. Would like to welcome you today's talk about discussion about the euro and the special emphasis or special direction towards France. My name is Thomas Oseng. I work in the economics department here at SMU. My specialty is international economics and economic development, and Jim Hollifield asked me to be the moderator for today's event. What I would like to do now is to introduce our presenters, and then we'll start with the presentations. Afterwards, we'll move on to questions from the audience and answers from the discussants. To my right is Professor James Hollifield. You have his bio in the handout, so I'll make this short. He is the Ora Nixon Arnold Professor of International Political Economy here at SMU and also the director of the Tower Center. He has worked on a variety of governmental and intergovernmental organizations and has published widely in international political and economic issues. To my left, to your right, is Dr. Mark Wynne. Mark is the Vice President and Associate Director of Research and Director of the Globalization Monetary Policy Institute at the Dallas Fed. Mark has joined the Fed in 1989. He has had a variety of responsibilities, including briefing the bank's president on national and international economic conditions prior to meetings of the Federal Open Market Committee. Mark has also taught at SMU. I think that's the very first time I met him when he was teaching a class. And in my department, Mark has taught both at the undergrad and graduate level. And he has also published numerous articles in a variety of well-recognized journals. With no further ado, I would like to ask Dr. Hollifield to give the first presentation.
Yes. I'm going to violate the rules and move out in front of the podium here because I like to move around when I talk. And I think we have this device here which is going to help me walk you through a presentation. There are at least one or two of my former students in here who may have heard some of this lecture before. But I think it's safe to say that what the Europeans have done, and there are a number of Europeans in the room here, what they have done since the 1940s and 50s is truly extraordinary. I think the one thing that you have to keep in mind, and students, please come on in and find yourself a seat. One thing you have to keep in mind is what happened to Europe in the early 20th century. With the wars, the destruction, and the creation of the EU and the Euro have really brought the Europeans together and created a peaceful Europe. So I'm going to give you a little background about the Euro and the Euro crisis, walk you through a quick PowerPoint here, and then Mark is going to get up. He's going to tell us how the Europeans are solving their problems. Someone once told me that I'm very good at defining the problem and laying it out, but I never have any solutions. So we're the perfect team. And one of the things you will learn about Mark is that he worked at the European Monetary Institute when they were setting up the euro. So he was present at the creation, although I know he doesn't like to take credit for all that has happened since. My approach to this is sort of 3 whys and 2 whats. I added an extra what here for this talk. But number one, why did the Europeans come together to create the European community, now known as the European Union? And secondly, why were they compelled to create a single currency, the euro? And why is the euro in crisis today? So these are my 3 whys. I just want to walk you through this a little bit like a lecture. What can be done to fix it? That's the question that Mark Wynne will answer. And what is the role of France in this crisis? So I will occasionally stop in my lectures and circle back to France. So that's sort of the outline of my talk. Well, first of all, I think we have to recognize that the EU is sui generis, to use the Latin expression. I'm a professor of international relations, and in history we have never seen anything quite like the EU before. It's not a nation state. France, Germany, Britain, they still retain their sovereignty. One way to think about this organization is each country has taken a little bit of its sovereignty and poured it into a common pool of sovereignty. With the creation of the euro, they poured a lot more of their sovereignty in this common pool. This is not simply an intergovernmental organization like the United Nations. So it's more than simply a UN of Europe. So it's neither fish nor fowl. What it is a supranational body in which the Europeans have pooled their sovereignty. For Americans, it's something more like a confederation. And I think the Europeans have gone through, they are going through right now, for the students of American history, what I would call their Articles of Confederation moment. So Americans should be very familiar with what the Europeans are struggling with. So why Europe? Why coming together? There are several reasons for this. This is, some would say it's sort of the latest effort to unite Europe. The Economist magazine has a column about Europe, about the EU. Does anyone know what the title of that column is? Charlemagne. It's called Charlemagne. And when the first article that appeared under that heading talked about Charles the Great, and he had a sword, his favorite sword, which he called Joyeuse. So Europe there have been attempts to unite Europe by the sword, by force, some of which we would prefer to forget. But after the war, Europe actually came together peacefully. There's a primary strategic rationale for this, which was to stop the slaughter in Europe, to rebuild Europe after 1945, and to make Europe a player on the international stage. I think the different countries realized that they cannot have the kind of power individually that they could have collectively. And here is something I want to stress over and over again in this talk. And I'm sitting up here with my two colleagues, the one in the middle who's a Rhinelander, a great friend and colleague with whom I have written a lot of things, Thomas Osang, who is German, and Mark Wynne, who is from Ireland. But the EU, Europe, was a Franco-German creation. So we have to always realize how critical the Franco-German couple is in this story. And this was a pragmatic move, not so much an idealistic move. I think the Europeans who created this, they were realistic enough to know that it would take time. They couldn't just announce the creation of the United States of Europe. And they were very pragmatic. Anybody recognize this man? That is the founder of the EU. That is Jean Monnet, who was Time Magazine's Man of the Year. That's probably around 1957 or 58. So if you want to look at the face of Europe, remember Jean Monnet, the Frenchman. This project was also a great liberal project. You can't be a member of this club unless you have a liberal parliamentary democracy. It's also a market-oriented club. So it requires you not only be democratic, but to be committed to open and free markets. The idea was that peace and prosperity will come through trade and open market economies. Now, this may be a bit of a problem for the French right from the start, because the French have never been too keen on what Charles de Gaulle would refer to as Anglo-Saxon liberalism. Remember, de Gaulle he didn't distinguish between Americans and the British. He just said they sont des Anglo-Saxons. So there is a tension, I think, in Europe. Some would say this is the fulfillment of Immanuel Kant's dream of perpetual peace, where you're locked into a form of government that is going to prevent future wars. Monnet's idea was, let's start small. Let's do the coal and steel union first. Let's focus on atomic energy first, and do things that all Europeans can agree on, And then we will move gradually, step by step, towards a more united Europe. This is just a map. We're up to 28 countries now, members of Europe. So it went from the original 6 to 28. This is just a quick depiction of what are the different pillars of European Union. One is obviously economic, the economic and monetary union itself, from the customs union, the Treaty of Rome, through the common market, the single market, single European Act, the Maastricht Treaty, and EMU. That's one pillar of European Union. The other is to have a common foreign security and defense policy. That's been much more difficult. And finally, to bring together justice and home affairs. I was sitting next to Patrick Esquer, and we were talking about Schengen, which is a controversial project that opens up the internal borders of Europe. Anybody recognize this man? This is, of course, Charles de Gaulle, one of his finer moments. He, interestingly enough, he had not yet quite come back to power when the European Community was launched in 1957. But he would be one of the principal architects going along with this idea of creating a common European home. How about this guy? This was his partner. Anybody remember him? That is the Bundeskanzler Konrad Adenauer. So when you think of the Franco-German couple, think of de Gaulle and think of Adenauer. Again, man of the year, Times Man of the Year. Europe has had two sides to it. It is it going to be a loose confederation or a federal United States of Europe? And I put up here that the French are not, they don't like the F word very much. So the French are not keen on federalism. De Gaulle's idea for Europe was not a federal Europe. He called it l'Europe des patries. So it was a Europe of individual sovereign nation states. It went from 6 in its founding. France, Germany, Benelux. Who was the 6th? Do you remember?
Luxembourg.
Well, Benelux. Belgium, Netherlands. Don't forget Italy. The Italians know a good thing when they see it. France was intended to be the political leader of Europe. The Germans were happy to join the French. They would be the economic leaders of Europe. That was the idea. The Germans in the 1950s were sick and tired of politics. They wanted to get on with their lives, to rebuild their country. The French were more interested in being a powerful player on the international stage, and this provided them with the opportunity. So this is what I call the fameux couple franco-allemand. You could ask yourself, where is perfidious Albion? So I'm referring to Britain or the English, who were excluded, blackballed. De Gaulle did not allow the British in. It was not until after his death that the British were invited to join. And of course, there's always the question of just how democratic is Europe. Why EMU and the Euro? This is my second why. We did why Europe, now why EMU? This goes back to the 1970 and something called the Werner Report. You can trace the history of this single currency through the 1970s, 1980s, until its creation in the Maastricht Treaty in 1992. The main reason, and again, this is a Franco-German push. I mentioned here about Giscard d'Estaing and Helmut Schmidt. Encore le couple franco-allemand. And the period of the Trente Glorieuses, a nice French expression. You had these glorious 30 years of economic growth from 45 to roughly 75. Everything got much more difficult from the 1970s, especially with respect to managing currencies and exchange rates. And I think there was a recognition that unless the Europeans come together and form a single currency, they're never going to get the full benefits of having a united Europe. The end of the Cold War was a moment of great high idealism. German unification in 1989. And the question, with Germany coming together, are we going to have a German Europe again or a European Germany? And we know that I think it was Hans Dietrich Genscher paraphrasing Thomas Mann. He said we want to have a European Germany, not a German Europe. And there was a deal that was struck at the time of the end of the Cold War. You can call it an idealistic deal or a realistic deal. The German Chancellor Helmut Kohl wanted support for German unification. He needed the French and, of course, the British. And he struck a deal with François Mitterrand, the cold, calculating French president. Many of you remember Tonton. And Mitterrand would agree to German unification only if the Germans would agree to the creation of a single currency, which would give the French and other Europeans a much greater say, presumably, in the making of European monetary policy. The beginning of this was not good. You had the exchange rate mechanism, which collapsed in the early 90s. But the die had been cast for economic and monetary union, and the deal had been struck. I mentioned Margaret Thatcher, who was opposed to German unification, very skeptical of Europe and European integration, and certainly opposed to the euro and the common currency. The British, as you know, opted out. So why is the euro in crisis today? Well, Mark Wynne will tell us about why it might not be an optimum currency area. There has been an attempt to force convergence of the European economies through something called the Stability and Growth Pact and criteria that are supposed to bring about a convergence between the weaker deficit countries of the South and the surplus countries of the North. What you had instead over a 10-15 year period was a pretty radical and rapid convergence of high and low productivity countries. A rapid consolidation of capital markets, but without a banking union, which created these enormous financial stresses that came to the fore in the 2000s. So the challenge today, of course, is to achieve fiscal discipline. Remember, we have a monetary union, but not a fiscal union, and no banking union. So this has forced very painful structural reform on many states, including France, Italy, Greece, Portugal, Spain, and others. This is just a picture here of the French economy. They stole this out of the Financial Times. If you look at France's real GDP and its annual percent change, it has been very sluggish, just barely growing in 2012, 13, 14. There are forecasts that it's going to grow better next year. And you've got this problem of the budget deficit in France, which is over 4%. I think the latest figures were 4.6%. That exceeds the 3% limit set by the Stability Pact. So France is really struggling economically. And we can talk more about whether its economic struggles, how that affects the political struggles in France. France is going to miss its budget targets. Here I just quickly summarize the debates that are going on. It's at 4.6%, projected to be 4.4% this year. The target is 3%. And politically, you know that the French president, François Hollande, and his finance minister, Michel Sapin, are on the horns of a very difficult dilemma here. The government has promised to cut 50 billion euros from France's big public spending bill over the next 3 years. This has really angered the French left, Monsieur Montebourg, who is opposed to this austerity and structural reform. In the meantime, the opposition in the form of the liberal right in France is in disarray. Just a couple of days ago, we saw the announcement of Le Retour de Sarko, Monsieur Sarkozy, who said he is coming back to save France from devastation and destruction. And we have witnessed the continued rise of the Front National. So I assume many of you recognize this gentleman, Jean-Marie Le Pen, who is sort of the voice in France of anti-EU, anti-globalization sentiments, and I would say opposed to sort of Anglo-Saxon style liberal market economies. So we've got a problem in France and in Europe. A lack of discipline, a lack of institutions. There's no common treasury. There's a national bank which is not supposed to function as a lender of last resort, but it has in fact done that, as we've seen under Mario Draghi. There's no legislature in Europe that can fix taxation and spending policies. There's no agency for regulating banks or the Securities and Exchange Commission for regulating security markets. So the result was, when the euro was launched, was a gigantic spending spree, housing bubbles, and major financial crises. France sort of initially sidestepped some of these problems, but it has sunk itself also into crisis. So the what can be done to fix it? How do we get out of a very deep financial hole? Who will underwrite all this sovereign debt? Is it going to be mutualized? and who will underwrite the banks in Europe? So how can the countries in Northern Europe, in particular, avoid the moral hazard of underwriting the debt in the southern countries and having them turn around and get into the same fiscal problems that they have been in before? So this, for Americans, this should sound very familiar because it's where the young American Republic found itself under the Articles of Confederation, and we know that it would take writing a new constitution and Alexander Hamilton and the creation of a national bank and really the collectivization or mutualization of the American debt. So some people don't realize the American Republic itself was created in a sovereign debt crisis because it had cost us so much money to defeat the British, with some help from the French, I might add. So this, again, as I said, looks very familiar, like the Articles of Confederation. So where is Jean Monnet? Where is Alexander Hamilton? What we have instead is a very adroit Italian banker named Mario Draghi. Some have referred to him as Super Mario, who has ridden to the rescue here and trying to resurrect the European economy. I think it is safe to say, Mark, that he has conquered, at least for the moment, the debt crisis. And I'm really eager to hear more of what Mark has to say about this. Will he be able to pull it off, the hat trick? Right now he's edging up to quantitative easing and purchasing more assets in order to keep the European economy out of deflation. But waiting in the wings are the populists, the anti-Euro leaders, and I will end with this slide here. Perhaps that's a good one for me to end on. I just put something up there in French for you to contemplate. Right now, it looks like if there were a straight runoff between her and François Hollande in the next French presidential election, she would probably beat it. The question is, would the liberal mainstream French right come together with the socialist communist left to stop it? My guess is they probably would. So on that note, I'll stop and turn the microphone over to Mark Wynne. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim, for a very concise and enlightening journey through European history. Mark, we're looking forward to your remarks.
Thank you. Jim and I have done a variety of presentations on the Euro crisis over the past couple of years. I was very disappointed this year that things stayed so calm in Europe because it deprived me of several good free lunches. I'm not actually going to talk so much about the Euro crisis today. I'm just going to focus just on some of the specifics having to do with France. How it has become the ailing man of Europe. There's two stories here. There's a story of its public finances and the growing uncompetitiveness of French exports. How do we fix this? Well, it's actually pretty easy to know. We know what needs to be done. The hard part is getting it done. Has the euro played a role in this? It has played a small role. It is limiting the options that are now available to the French governments. And then I'll talk a bit about the prospects. So here's an economic snapshot of the French economy as of September of this year. Growth in GDP stalled in the second quarter. Unemployment is now at about 10% of the labor force. It's twice that among the under 25s, which is not a recipe for social stability. If you wonder where European recruits for ISIS are coming from, I mean, when you have a disaffected youth in a lot of Western European countries, ideologies like those offered by ISIS or ISIL or whatever the right name is, seem very attractive in times of high unemployment. The government deficit, as Jim mentioned, is expected to hit 4% of GDP this year. We have a debt-to-GDP ratio that's now 93%. Some of you may know a couple of years ago, two Harvard economists published a wonderful book called This Time is Different. How, during every boom or bubble, we tell a story about how this time is different and things are going to play out well. And one of the facts they documented in that book, which studied something like 800 years of financial history, is that once you get to a debt-to-GDP ratio of about 90%, it gets really hairy. It's just very, very hard to sustain that level of debt relative to the size of your economy. France is now at that level, and there is few signs of any stabilization anytime soon. And then, of course, the finance minister recently announced that they're just not going to abide by the rules. And this is where the whole politics of the European Union comes into play, is, you know, to what extent are these rule books that are supposed to govern the management of the euro flexible? Or are there different rules for the big players versus the small players? This is just a picture showing you how the prospects for growth and inflation have evolved over the past year. These are vintages, forecasts for next year's growth and inflation. You see a steady downward revision of growth expectations for next year. And you see in particular that downward trend in the red line, which is the growing concern about deflation. So the inflation numbers are getting lower and lower. The expectations of inflation for next year are getting lower. This is what really motivated the announcement by the European Central Bank last month to engage in a QE-type program, the details of which will be announced next month. And it's not, of course, deflation in the French economy. It's the fear of deflation in the entire euro area, because several countries within the euro area are already experiencing deflation. Why should we care? Well, France is still the 9th largest economy in the world and is the 2nd largest economy in the euro area. We trade a lot with France. We exported 32 billion worth of goods to France in 2013. And we have something like 226 billion in foreign direct investment from French firms in the United States. Even Texas is an important trading partner with France. And there's actually an additional reason why Texas should be concerned about this. Most of you know that the oldest building in Austin is the French legation building. France was the first country to recognize Texas as a sovereign nation in 1836. So we have that special historical tie. Texas had an embassy in Paris during the 9 years that it was an independent country. And I bet most of you do not know where this embassy was. It was actually on the Place Vendôme, and there's a plaque there. If you know where to look, if you go to the Place Vendôme, there's a little plaque right next to the Hotel Vendôme saying that this was the site of the Texas legation from 1836 to 1845. Texas had embassies in 2 foreign countries, the United Kingdom and France. I'm assuming we had an embassy in Washington, but I don't know. Jim mentioned how important France is to the European project, and the European project is a Franco-German enterprise, has been since the beginning of the 1950s. And France matters geopolitically. It is hugely important. It is one of a handful of countries in the world that has both the capacity and the willingness to project military power outside of its national borders to address global security issues. You have the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and then pretty much after that you're running out of countries. So they really, really matter when, in times of global turmoil. So here's a very long-term perspective on French GDP, which is the broadest measure of economic activity in France, going back to 1950. There's the Trente Glorieuses, when GDP was growing rapidly. It pivoted. So you see the blue trend line. It pivoted in 1975, which is when the Trente Glorieuses ended. There was a global slowdown in growth in the mid-1970s for reasons we still don't fully understand. But then it dropped down to a lower trajectory from 75 onwards. But you see there at the very end a deviation even from the post-1975 trend. And you can see this a little bit more clearly in this picture. So here I'm just looking at a trend for the first part of this century, from 2000 up until the global financial crisis. That's the green line. And you see that GDP has been persistently underperforming the trend, the trajectory they were on prior to the global financial crisis. Well, they had 2 crises. They had the global financial crisis that we caused, and then the European sovereign debt crisis. This has implications then for living standards. Okay, if GDP is growing and your GDP is not growing, your population is continuing to grow. This is one of the last slides I'll have, is showing how one of the things the French are really good at is reproducing. But basically, per capita GDP has been stagnant. Living standards have basically been stagnant in France since 2007, 2008. There's been no increase in living standards on average in France. And this has also happened at the European level. Again, because France is such a big part of the euro area economy. Now, they're not causing, some countries in Europe have actually seen declines in living standards. Ireland, Greece, some of the so-called peripheral countries. But the entire euro area, this is part of the sense of crisis in Europe, is that you've seen stagnant living standards since the onset of the global financial crisis and the debt crisis 6 years ago. They have high unemployment. It's not quite as bad as it was in the 1990s. But 10% unemployment is not a recipe for long-term social stability. So what's the fundamental problem? The fundamental problem is productivity growth. Okay, ultimately, the way a country gets rich, improves its living standards over time, it's not just by accumulating capital and having more workers. It's actually making those workers and that capital more productive. And this just shows you the trends in productivity growth. Again, going back to 1950, there's the Trente Glorieuses. Steady productivity growth, a big slowdown post-1975, and then a real stagnation in the period since the global financial crisis. That's the fundamental problem they're dealing with. So what's caused this slowdown in productivity growth? And this ties into the public finances issue. So here's gross financial liabilities, assets and net liabilities of the French government going back to 1969. Through the 1970s, the French government ran balanced budgets. Okay? Their outstanding debt was more or less matched by the assets that the French state owned. So they had zero net liabilities because they were running balanced budgets and they owned a lot of stuff, and that offset what they did in fact owe. Starting in the 70s, they started to run big deficits. And you saw the growth of the net liabilities to the general public had grown out to about 90% of GDP. And this correlates, the growth of the French state basically correlates dramatically with the productivity slowdown. So here we're just starting in 65. This is the rate of productivity growth over 5-year intervals. You see a steady slowdown from about 5% productivity growth to something about half of 1% in the 5 years ended most recently. Just so the steady deceleration as the size of the state has grown. And basically we're measuring the size of the state here by the taxes and social security contributions as a share of GDP. So there's this really remarkable negative correlation. You push down productivity growth, you've got a serious structural long-term problem. Yeah. The way you address that, obviously you have to have certain government services, but you have to finance them efficiently if you want to be able to afford them long-term. Does the euro hurt or help? Well, what the euro means is that certain options that were available 15 years ago are now off the table. Specifically, you can no longer deflate or inflate or devalue away your problems. And this is what I've, in other presentations, called the so-called Cortes strategy. When Cortes landed in Mexico with his less than enthusiastic band of adventurers, the way he incentivized them was by burning his ships. I mean, it's not a completely true story, but if you know there's no going back, then you're going to be a bit more motivated to push the campaign forward, right? So once you know that you've taken these options off the table, presumably you can build the coalitions necessary to push through difficult reforms instead of just inflating or devaluing them away. The problem is this may work for small countries like Portugal or Ireland or Greece or whatever. It's a different story when you're dealing with the second largest economy in the Eurozone. And that's where the big issues are politically that are being played out between the Chancellery and the Elysee Palace. The ECB has been hammering on this issue ever since it was launched. This is a statement from one of the press conferences after the launch of the euro in April 1999. Basically, the ECB has been saying, we're going to do our part for price stability, but you guys have really got to deliver your part of the bargain by engaging in the necessary structural reforms that are an essential part of making this monetary union work. Because as it constituted originally, it just is not a viable long-term arrangement. And they've been beating on this point every press conference, every monthly bulletin they've put out over the past 15 years to limit its success. The OECD has written extensively about the need for reform in France. This is just an excerpt from the latest multi-hundred-page report they put out, all the things they could do to fix the French economy. I mean, there's a lot of things the French do very, very well. They have lots of big, important multinationals, so it's not a completely hopeless case, as is the case with certain other European countries, but there are some serious structural rigidities that need to be addressed.
You're not naming any names?
No. But, one metric, so the World Bank puts out this ease of doing business measures. France ranked 38th in the world in terms of ease of doing business last year. So it was behind Rwanda and Armenia. It's the lowest ranked of the big industrial OECD countries, which it's not a good position for the 9th largest economy in the world to be in. This is a composite ranking. There are some things that function very, very well in France, for example. In contract enforcement, there's a legal system that's reasonably reliable and so on. So they rank 7th in that, but they ranked 80th in terms of investor protections. So there are clear issues that have been identified by groups, the World Bank doesn't have an agenda here. I mean, they're trying to do an objective ranking of different countries and metrics, so they're not pushing the program. The OECD doesn't have an agenda. They're just trying to help make the economies function better. So the last thing I will leave you with, or second last thing, is demography. This is another reason why this is important. Based on current trends, France will be the biggest country in Europe by the middle of this century if they continue current population growth rates. The German population has peaked and is already declining. Fertility rates in Germany are extraordinarily low, and that's creating a whole new set of issues for the German economy. But France, they still reproduce quite enthusiastically. So by 2050, I would say that France will become the largest country by population in Europe. Now, if they're also a large poor country, that's not going to augur well for Europe going forward. You want the largest country to be a large, wealthy country if the union is to prosper. So economically strong is really vital to the success of the European project, but as everybody, there's this great quote from Jean-Claude Juncker, who's the incoming president of the European Commission, is that we all know what we need to do. The problem is we just don't know how to get re-elected when we do it. So actually, the economics is very, very simple. The hard part is the black art of politics. It's how you sell these programs to electorates that are going to have to endure some pain to make the necessary reforms. And I'll leave you with this great iconic picture from Financial Times of a forlorn President Hollande standing in the rain. And I think it neatly symbolizes the enormous task he is faced with going forward. This is from the celebrations on the Ile de Seine in August. This is there's a great story behind why they have this celebration every August there, that the entire male population left in 1940 to join the Free French to fight with de Gaulle after the collapse of France in 1940. So they have this celebration on this little island every year to commemorate the liberation of Paris in August 1944. But I think it's destined to become an iconic picture because it sort of symbolizes the enormous task ahead of him and what he's dealing with. So with that, I'll stop. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark, for a wonderful presentation. It's my honor to get to ask the first question, and then we'll open up the mic to everyone here in the room. Both Jim and Mark presented the basic facts on the French economy, including the excessively high deficit to GDP ratio. What you didn't do is you didn't talk about the sort of champion of austerity in Europe, which is Germany, which expects to have a balanced budget next year for the first time in 40 years or so. So you have the two countries, the two main countries in Europe, going in very different directions in terms of their fiscal policies, and obviously that is at odds with a rescue or a strategy for the euro. So I just would like to get your take. And
that's such an easy question. I'm going to let Mark Wynne answer.
So I've always believed that the monetary union, as originally envisioned in the Maastricht Treaty, was workable if people abided by the rules. There was a set of rules laid down as to who should join and then what you should do after you've joined. The problem is they violated the rules from the outset. So the rules were important because it is not what we technically call an optimum currency area. You still don't have the degree of labor mobility within Europe that you have in the United States, and you don't have the sharing of risks at the federal level that we have. Both of those things make the US work as a monetary union. So then you're going to have really, really tough rules and make sure they're enforced. They violated the rules like from day one by admitting Italy and Belgium, because they both had debt to GDP ratios in excess of the 60% limit, but they had to be admitted for political reasons because they were part of the original six. And then the second big violation occurred in 2003, 2004, when Germany and France ran afoul of the Stability and Growth Pact, and that then just sort of opened the door for chaos. Now they're now trying to rewrite the rules on the run. They have a new fiscal compact. But how you enforce these things among sovereign nations is a very difficult issue. I mean, The one thing France has that Germany doesn't have is nuclear weapons. I mean, if you want to put it very quickly, this is a big, important country, and they can't be pushed around. The new fiscal compact envisions taking countries to court if they break the rules. I mean, does anybody seriously, how do you enforce a court ruling against a major military power if they don't want to go along with it? So it's ultimately actually a political issue on how the Chancellor of Germany can deal with the President of France and how they can sort of... And I personally think that Chancellor Merkel has done an extraordinary job of sort of navigating between what the concerns of the German electorate, which I think are very, very legitimate concerns. I mean, this is why they insist on these rules. They don't want to be part of a transfer union such as exists between northern and southern Italy. And that's a situation they want to avoid. But how do you sort of navigate between the German electorate and then the French desires for they have a slightly different agenda? It's tough, but it is ultimately the black art of politics as opposed to economics. I think the economics is very simple.
That's what I always tell my students. Economics is simple, straightforward. Politics, perhaps not so much so.
All right, let's take the first question from the audience. If you could use the mic, that would be great.
And say who you are when you ask.
Colin Clark. Quick comments and a question. The comment JP Morgan on the issue of optimal currency area. I think y'all probably saw this, but had a really wonderful graphic where they talked about lots of different countries and how well suited they are to have a common currency, and they actually found that all of the countries of the world that start with M belong together better than the countries in the European Union. I thought that's kind of funny. But the question, I've heard the argument made that they're potentially going about the issue of trying to harmonize what they're doing with the banks in a way that is dangerous, and whoever can take this. But the basic idea being that in the United States, one thing we got very right in 2009 was that by the time we announced a credible stress test and executed it, we actually had a backstop. We knew where the money was coming from, and we announced that the banks had equity holes. That in Europe, there have not been credible stress tests so far. They assert they're going to, but to the extent they find some banks don't have enough capital, they have no idea where the capital would come from. What's going to happen?
Another easy question for Mark.
That is a really, really good question. I think the amount of the backstop that is available to the entire, I can't remember what the name of the entity is that supposedly is going to back the entire European banking system. The resources available to that entity are the same as what the Irish government spent bailing out the Irish banking sector 6 years ago. So that's how little they have. Now mind you, Ireland went through the biggest banking crisis probably in the history of the world. They went from a debt to GDP ratio of 25% to 125% as a result of bailing out their banks in 1 year. But that's how limited resources. But Ireland is small. It was a big crisis relative to a small economy. It was huge, in fact. But that's what you're getting at. I mean, this is a very legitimate question. That's why I personally think this problem is not over by a long shot. Ultimately, it becomes a political issue because you're going to have. It's essentially a variant on the fiscal union. It's a variant on risk sharing. The reason we sort of got through the Texas banking crisis so well, I mean, it was pretty devastating for those of you who were here in the 1980s. I came at the tail end of it. It devastated the Texas economy. If the Texas government had to address that problem on its own, it would have been a lot worse. We survived in part because of massive transfers from the rest of the United States through deposit insurance and so on. And that's essentially what you need to make a banking union work. And that inherently has fiscal implications because the resources ultimately come from the public sector.
Thank you.
Next question. Hi, I'm Ian Smith. This is a question for Dr. Wynne. You talked about France and their population is reproducing enthusiastically. What part of their population is reproducing enthusiastically? Is it all of it, or is it primarily the immigrant population?
I don't think it's just the immigrant population, but you are right. There are big differences in the birth rates among the immigrant groups. There's a large North African immigrant group in France, but I think even among the indigenous French, the longer history there, I think they also have a pretty high birth rate.
I actually written a lot about this whole demographic question and the immigrant question. And the French, for those of you who know a little bit of French history, in the 19th century, France went through the earliest and demographic transition in the world. The French population became very stagnant. It had also been devastated by the Napoleonic Wars. And if there's one national preoccupation in France, it's demography, population. There was something in the 1930s, after the Great War, the French formed something called l'Alliance nationale pour l'accroissement de la population française. And so the natalist movement, the populationist movement, and there was always the feeling that the reason the French had struggled so much vis-a-vis Germany in the conflicts of the 20th century was their stagnant population. So after the Second World War, and when France had lost, capitulated, and been occupied, de Gaulle and the Fourth Republic reformers put in place a new population policy, something called les allocations familiales. So you are paid a substantial amount of money to have children. And that policy does work at some level. Of course, it's true that the immigrant population, they have higher birth rates. This is a normal and natural thing, and they may benefit even more from les allocations familiales. Just one little anecdote about this. When I was working in France in the Institut National d'Études Démographiques, INED, the big National Institute for Demographic Studies, we had constant visits from Soviet delegations. The Russians were trying to figure out, how to stop population decline, and they adopted the French policy. But it was not the white Russian population that benefited from this. It was the people in the peripheral republics, especially the Muslim population. And in the United States today, of course, it's the immigrant population in this country that has helped us keep our birth rates above replacement levels. So immigrants are doing this for countries all over the world, not just for France. But France does have a much more dynamic population, demographically speaking.
That would be the three main
One second.
actions.
Yeah, you can introduce yourself and
Yeah.
ask your question.
Patrick, what is the main three actions that France needs to be doing now just to get out of this mess?
Another question for Mark.
I think any adoption of any of the proposed reforms, the OECD has books and books of proposed reforms of the different sectors in France. You could do anything would make things better. So I don't have a particular policy that I'd say is the number one thing. If you could build a consensus behind the need, one thing is educate people about globalization. There's an enormous opposition to globalization or being open to the rest of the world within France, and educating people about the benefit of globalization and international trade would be hugely beneficial, because ultimately people decide who gets elected. So having people understand, this is not something you can prevent. The world has changed. I gave a talk yesterday to the Consular Corps down in Houston at our branch there, and pointed out to them, as of 2 years ago, more economic activity takes place in the so-called emerging market economies than takes place in the advanced economies. Mm-hmm. This world has changed. It's no longer the world most of us grew up in, where 2/3 of global economic activity took place in the North Atlantic region. Mm-hmm. The global center of economic gravity is shifting from the North Atlantic to Asia. That's not going to stop. China is going to be bigger than the United States within the next 5 years, if it is not already, economically. That's going to have huge implications for people here. There's a lot of opposition to globalization here. I think there's stronger, visceral opposition to globalization and internationalness in France. So educating people about the benefits of globalization would help, and that's a simple thing.
Mark,
but then there's lots of reforms in the banking sector, the retail sector, and labor markets, hiring and firing. This thing with the sort of retirement age that they keep jiggling with, there was the 40-hour work week thing. Any of these things, if you change or get rid of or liberalize, would make the economy more competitive. The French are extremely innovative. They come up with great ideas. They have some world-beating firms, but then they're hobbled at home, I think, in terms of competition, and that impacts productivity. Mm-hmm. So it can be done, I think. But if you want specific recommendations, I'd go just look at any of these OECD books, and they'll put you to sleep, because there's so much. There's a lot of stuff and I should say, it's not just, they have lots of recommendations for lots of countries, including the United States.
Mm-hmm. Well, the French have an expression, I just wanted to put it in here, which the French in the room will understand. We don't have this expression in English, but it's called les extrêmes se touchent. So when you talk about promoting globalization, you have Monsieur Montebourg and others on your left, and you have Monsieur and Madame Le Pen on the right. So the problem is a political one in that sense. Making space for a more open, liberal economy, politically speaking, is very, very difficult for the French to do.
So, excuse me to ask again. So why did Germany did it and the French are not able to make it?
But that's ultimately a political thing. I like to sort of point to the example of the United Kingdom in the mid-1970s. Eventually, sometimes the country has to sink so low. I don't know if you recall what it was like or paid attention to what was happening in the United Kingdom in the 1970s, but they used to be the sick man of Europe.
Yep.
And eventually enough people were tired of that and said, we're going to elect somebody
Yep.
to do something about this. Now, you need to have a political consensus to get the reformer elected. And then that reformer has to be really lucky, because that reformer in England was on her way out of office until the Argentinians and the Falkland Islands. She was not going to be a two-term prime minister or a three-term prime minister, and she was just lucky that the Argentinians chose to engage in a silly military expedition that completely changed the electoral calculus in 1983, I think, got her re-elected, and she could push through the rest of the reforms. So it's a combination of factors. Germany, I remember, was being characterized as a sick man of Europe in the early 2000s. And Gerhard Schroeder pushed through some really important labour market reforms that I think
What's
have
it
made
called?
the world.
Agenda
Again, that's what I told
2010.
them.
Yeah.
And by the way, the same thing with Reagan.
Sorry?
Same thing with Reagan.
Yeah.
Yes, to a certain degree.
So, but it ultimately, I think economically, knowing what needs to be done, it's easy for economists to identify the things that you could do that would help. The hard thing is then assembling the political coalition so that if the pain gets shared and everybody sees that the gains are going to come at some point.
Hi, I'm Lynn Novak, Senior Fellow here at the Tower Center. And my question is about the political will in France. Our son has been there for well over 20 years, and I was shocked to hear him say in our last conversation that he was beginning to wonder why they should be listening to Angela Merkel and why they don't try the other means of spending more in order to build the economy.
Well, that has been tried. The left government that was elected in 1981, some of you may remember the Common Program, in which the French decided they would try to spend their way out of a big crisis. And that program came very close to breaking the French economy because, of course, if you pump a lot of money into an economy that's still relatively open, the French were crossing the Swiss border with large suitcases full of cash. So they tried to put capital controls on to stop that. I think those who were planning a holiday in New York were told they could take 400 francs with them on the trip, I think, if you recall. And François Mitterrand, who was the president, decided at some point, enough of this. And he did a 180-degree turn. The communists left his government. His finance minister was a man named Jacques Delors. For my students who are in here, you're going to have to know who he is. Along with Jean Monnet, Delors was the real savior in many ways of Europe, and he was the architect, the father in some ways of the euro. The reward for the finance minister having convinced the French government to change course was that he was appointed president of the European Commission. And those are in the room who are old enough to remember Delors. For some reason, he never wanted to be president of France, although his daughter, Martine Aubry, has tried a couple of times. But the problem in an open, globalized, economy like this is if you try to go it alone, and buck the trends, you're just going to get hammered economically, and that's what happened to the French in the early 80s. They recovered, and the French economy did quite well. But I would go back to what I said earlier. I think there may be other countries, somebody in the room can help me, that have a more difficult political setup. The Italians seem to be making progress. Mr. Renzi, who has brought parties together, but the French have an enormous political problem. And of course, it's, the French term is a bouc émissaire. You're always looking for scapegoats. Perhaps you can, but the strong euro has not prevented Germany from from really doing extremely well. So, do we blame it all on the Germans? I don't know.
Do you see a populist surge toward wanting to resist the austerity?
Well, there's populism all over Europe. I mean, you have the Alternative für Deutschland, you have the UK Independence Party. So there is a lot of opposition to both Europe and to globalization, which often gets conflated with opposition to immigration and other things that are associated with globalization. So this is going on around Europe. So Europe is in a very difficult moment, not just the French. And I think of people who are committed to the European project are very worried about this. And if you have mainstream voters in France saying, well, let's give Le Pen a try.
It wasn't Le Pen. It
Not
was
Le Pen.
Le Pen, but just irritation at Merkel trying to push the austerity.
Well,
Just one comment. I mean, the main argument against this argument against austerity would be the slide that Mark had on the relationship between government spending and productivity. But if government spending really, really worked, then productivity should go up. But it was the opposite. Spending increased and productivity fell. And I mean, how can you argue with those trends, right? Let's take Daniel.
Yeah, and get a microphone.
And then-
introduce you.
Okay. Yeah, I was gonna sort of answer and comment and question at the same time, because you come back to the politics, and of course the voters on the street are not reading all your economic data. They're being driven by other forces, and I think measurably in the culture from the time of the 50s, I'm teaching France since 45 now, we can see it all over the place. The Eurozone represents two forces that are drivers of nationalism in France and have always been, which is Americanization, American-style liberalism, going back to de Gaulle's resistance, and the very problematic relationship that France has long had with Germany, and this antagonism and the idea that Germany is going to hold sway over France. And so these resistances to Angela Merkel and German-style programs or American-style liberalism are drivers of nationalism, and it's not necessarily based on rational or economic data. And that seems to me a very intractable problem that is getting worse, and this is what drives these nationalist parties. And I don't know what to do about that. I've been studying a long time. I don't know what to do about that. And I wonder if you know what to do about that.
Well, part of the purpose of the European Union was to limit, these nationalist tendencies and outbreaks of nationalism and populism. It's as simple as that.
Okay,
Last question.
Yeah,
last question.
It would seem to me that while there is supposedly a union, the only way that you will have change is if you have enforceable rules. And since we don't have enforceable rules, what we end up with, each country has to decide on its own that things are so bad that it's going to make changes. The only way to have enforceable rules is to say to a country that thumbs its nose, like Hungary at the EU, is you're out. Or somebody like Greece that doesn't obey all the fiscal rules, is you're out of the euro. And if you don't do that, it just depends on each individual country as to whether things get so bad that internally it decides that let's make its own changes. But the EU seems to have no effect on what they do.
Well, most of us in this room are Americans. I mean, surely this sounds familiar to you. I used to live in Massachusetts, and their neighboring state of New Hampshire, they have this motto, which is live free or die. For those of us in Texas, I mean, Texas always gets along with the central federal government, right? We never have any tensions there. So, this problem of unifying a diverse set of countries, bringing them together under a common set of rules, Americans of all people should understand how difficult that is. So, I don't want us to end on an incredibly pessimistic note here. I mean, and I've given many talks in Europe. One I would point to, years ago, I was invited to speak in Warsaw to a joint Polish-German audience, and it was about Europe and the EU. And many people from around Warsaw saw that there was a Texan. This was in the height of the Bush era. A Texan coming to talk about Europe and the EU. And they all came to hear what I had to say. And they were shocked that I was incredibly positive and congratulated the Europeans on what they had accomplished. And just think of this. Could you have dreamed in 1945 that you could go to a big, happy conference in Warsaw, sponsored by Germans and Poles, working together and talking about a common European home? So let's not overdo it. I mean, Europe has come a heck of a long way. Sure, it's got problems. I mean, we had some problems in our own country. How long did it take for us to develop a strong federal central government? Some people still don't like that idea very much in the U.S., especially here in Texas. Mark, would you like to add any concluding remarks to that?
No, I mean, I agree that the European Union, compared to what happened in the 1940s, it's been worth all the money that's been spent. I mean, you spend, a week trying, visit Normandy to see all the graveyards, look at the horrors, the obscenities that occurred in the first half of the 1940s. And I think the European Union prevented a recurrence of something like that. It has been a worthwhile investment. My only concern has always been going forward that as the memory of that period fades, and just becomes another historical episode, that the will to make the kind of compromises necessary to keep the show on the road will sort of dissipate, and that there's always the risk that nationalism will again come to dominate the commitment to the European project. I mean, that's ultimately a political issue, not something I have any expertise on.
Well, thank you. We're out of time. Let's give our two presenters a big round of applause. And thank you all for coming and your interest in New York.
They have a 35-hour work week. You have to tell the people